Welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we are talking with Terry Lee. Terry, thanks very much for the first segment, talking about operation resilience. Now let's change gears and talk about vendor risk management. What is vendor risk management? Because sometimes it seems like it's confused with supply chain management and relationship management. So what is vendor?
Hey, Alex. So vendor risk management is one of these domains that has, like a lot of things, different meanings to different people. Depends on the vertical industry that you are in, and depends on what that company actually produces in terms of products and services. Vendor risk management, in short, is understanding the risks associated with doing business with third, fourth, fifth party vendors. Every company today uses vendors or third parties, whether they're the hot dog stand on the corner in New York City. That hot dog proprietor got their buns and their hot dogs and the condiments from maybe different places. That would be a third party to them, just like a bank who does business with different vendors or a manufacturer. The, some of the variations having to do with supply chain risk management. The supply chain risk management tends to be more focused on the physical supply of products and services, where there's logistics involved and inventory and warehousing involved. But the premise is the same. What are the risks in doing business with a given vendor?
So you mentioned working with the third parties, et cetera. And in our first segment, we talked about operational resilience.
Sure.
Is there a reason why vendor risk management is becoming such a hot topic, I guess? Is it because of some of these standards and things that are coming out that we talked about in the first segment?
Well, I think regulatory standards have driven a lot of it, but unlike operational resilience, where there's a definite overlap into vendor risk management, because you're using vendors to produce products and services. And if there's a disruption at the vendor, there's likely going to be a disruption to you. And vendor risk management, there are definitely regulations that require it, but just fundamentally, so many companies require third-party vendors in order to survive. They've recognized that without those vendors, there's a high likelihood that they could not just be impacted, but be severely impacted. And cyber breaches tends to really drive that conversation. I think it was the Ponemon Institute in a study recently said that 59% of breaches a company experiences comes from a breach at one of their third party vendors.
Mhm.
There's lots of stories in the news about this on a weekly basis. So companies are really trying to understand how can they protect themselves.
So let's say I'm assigned the new vendor risk manager. I'm in charge of all the relationships. How do I go about approaching vendors and saying, I want to know what you do?
Well,
Because not everybody wants to be forthcoming, right?
no, and not everybody wants to participate in your vendor risk assessment. So, in a mature risk organization, it starts with procurement and contracting. It starts at the beginning of the relationship, so that when they're seeking a vendor or vendors to perform some kind of product or service for them, they're establishing up front that we're going to ask you questions about your information security, about your hiring practices, about your business practices, and we're going to assess risk in doing business with you on a regular basis. If you're a really important vendor to us, which might be determined by criticality of products and services, or might be determined by the spend, how much money they spend with that vendor. Those often referred to as tier one vendors, they're going to be assessed annually from a whole bunch of different
Mm.
perspectives, information security, HR practices, and they're going to conduct due diligence, collect artifacts, look at those artifacts and see if there are any problems, like a SOC 2 report, if the vendor is hosting technology for them, privacy and data management, if they're storing sensitive data or have access to their networks. And then they're going to decide how frequently do they need to assess those third-party vendors. What they're trying to understand is is there anything going on at the vendor that could impact their fulfillment of the service level agreements of the contracts that I've signed with them? And the one of the challenges is that often those things become disconnected across the risk framework of the organization. For example, the business continuity evaluation is not looking at the recovery time objectives of the processes that are using those vendors' products and services. So the contract has a service level agreement of 3 days to provide products and services. But the process that's using those products and services has a recovery time objective of 4 hours. There's a major disconnect. So it's most effective when it's part of the enterprise risk framework and program.
What happens if someone is not forthcoming with that information? Because you just went through a long list of things that you'd be asking, and they can, and I've seen it happen. I'm sure you have. A lot of companies will say, "Well, that's private. That goes against our privacy protocols, or that goes against
Yeah.
another regulation that we follow. We can't give you that information." How do you deal with those kind of situations? Do you just say, "Well, then goodbye, we'll find someone else"?
Well, that's what you should do. But that's what you should do. But as you know, there are vendors that I guess in some ways you could consider them too big to walk away from. For
Yeah.
example, if a company is hosting its infrastructure technology in one of the cloud service providers, they're going to be hard pressed to get the budget to say, we need to be able to switch everything over to a different cloud service provider in the event of a problem with our current provider, because it could be incredibly expensive to do that. And most companies won't spend that kind of money. There are techniques and methods of determining where the risk lies. There are external third-party data providers, data sources that will provide an additional perspective on that vendor from the outside looking in. And these vendors look at their network and their hosting and their technology from the outside looking in to determine are they updating the public facing servers with the latest patches? Are they providing at least some modicum of protection from cyber threats and cyber breaches? Um, One of the common challenges is asking that vendor for their business continuity test and exercise results. Do you want to see what happened in the last test or exercise? And a lot of vendors are, they're very reluctant to provide it, or, oh, it's too sensitive, I can't share it with you. The companies in vendor risk management, you're requiring and relying on these third-party vendors in order to survive, in order to produce your products and services. So you have to convey the message that, look, I'm not looking to bash you over the head with this. I'm not questioning, I'm counting on it. I'm counting on you to be able to recover and to participate and fulfill the terms of your contract because I need you. That's what the partnership is all about.
And you're kind of expecting to see, or at least I would expect to see issues, when you're
Yeah,
testing,
in
because
any
that's
kind of
showing that, hey,
scenario.
you're out there, you're pushing yourselves each time, trying to really find the gaps.
Yeah, I agree. And the best test at that is to have that third party vendor participate in your testing or scenario analysis. Have them in the room at the table, however you're doing your testing and exercising, and participate in the exercise or scenario to see, can they really continue to provide products and services like you require them to do. And today, if you ask an audience at a BCM conference, how many of you have your third party critical vendors annually at a test or an exercise? It's a tiny percentage. Still, companies, maybe 10% of the room will raise their hand and say that they're actually engaging with the third party vendors that way. And that's risky. That's pretty risky.
Well, I remember trying to get some third-party vendors involved with a test where I was back in 2004, 2005,
Yeah.
and trying to coordinate calendars was next to impossible.
Yeah.
Because the company had their own dates for testing and their own things they needed to do with people across multiple countries who'd be involved. And then we had our own as well, dates
Yeah.
that we could use, and people spread across multiple countries. trying to coordinate that is impossible.
Yeah,
So, and I know it's something that we're really striving for these days, involve your third parties. But how do you go about trying to even make that happen? Because you're not the only one asking for their time, and chances are pretty good you're being asked in your company to participate somewhere else as well. But
you
you end
are.
up with a department of one in business continuity who simply can't do it.
Yeah, it's you see a lot of organizations. It's happened in the organizations I've worked for as well. It's when you're a software vendor or technology provider, every one of your customers is likely to conduct an annual vendor risk assessment and ask for those artifacts every single year. And you don't get paid to do this. You have to do it for the relationship. You have to do it for
Mhm.
good risk management practices, and it's not uncommon to have a team of one or two people in your organization, and all they do is manage the response to vendor risk assessments because your organization has been deemed a tier one vendor. It's the cost of doing business.
Should NDAs come into this, non-disclosure agreements? Because I could be collecting a lot of information from Terry
Yeah.
Lee Incorporated. And I'm going to have a lot of that in my files, but then someone else is asking me for my information as well, which would include some of Terry Lee's and what he's
Yeah.
doing because I'm being asked about my third parties. So
Yeah.
how do you go about managing all this data and information that's going to be flowing between various partners who I may be giving information to that you're not a partner of theirs. So how do you go about managing all this information and the flow?
So there's a couple of different techniques that our customers use for doing that. Things like non-disclosure agreements, privacy agreements as well. Those are standard and typically done up front during the contracting process. Um, some organizations, ProTech Group included, uses a third-party service as an online vault for information security artifacts, policies, our privacy policies and reporting. We use this third-party service so that when a company says, I need to see, all of your IT policies, your information security and privacy policies, we're not constantly emailing, 30, 40 PDFs to them. We give them access to the online vault. Then we know who is in it, who's accessed what documents. And
Mm,
then when we have a new document or an update, we don't have to send it out to any of our 500 customers around the world. We simply put it in the vault and tell them the next time they come through for an assessment that it's accessible to them. You mentioned vendors of vendors, which is referred to as nth parties or fourth and fifth parties. That's a much more complicated problem because you don't have a contractual relationship directly with that organization. So in many cases, you can't send them a vendor risk assessment because they're not your vendor. They're your
yeah.
vendor's vendor. So you have to get at it indirectly with your third party vendors that you require knowing who are they buying products and materials for. And then ultimately you have to decide how far down that chain you're willing to go because the consideration is what are you going to do with that information? We look across the chain to the nth degree. And what I say the nth degree because it's based on the information that they collect from their third parties, and they can decide how far down they go. And then we map it to show them if there's a concentration risk somewhere. So if they're doing business with 50 tier one vendors, how many of them are actually doing business with common fourth party vendors? Because that could potentially be a concentration risk for the company because the potential impact if
Mm.
that fourth party goes away, it may not impact just one of your third parties, it could impact many of your third parties. So it's a way to give them insights into the relationships, and then they can take action from there and decide if they want to dig deeper.
That was going to be my next question, actually, is how far down that chain do you go? Because we do
You,
hear stories
yeah,
of people that are dealing with a third party, but they haven't gone far enough and they find out that it originates, the original materials to develop this product and on all the different sales channels starts off in a regime you're not supposed to be doing business with, or in a
yeah,
country that has terrible labor laws or something
yes.
along that lines.
Yeah.
Do you look at those kind of things and say, we'll accept the risk, we'll look at, at this much of the chain and the rest will accept the risk? How do you go about that?
You do. By understanding what those relationships are, that gives you insight into who they're doing business with, and you could then go deeper from there. And what I mean by deeper is there are services available that provide cyber assessments, financial assessments of companies for fee. And you could then decide that for this given group of fourth party or even fifth party vendors, we're going to, for example, we're going to pull their financial reports from publicly available services or fee-based services. And we're going to look at their financials to determine how critical, what's their current situation, is their cyber program in good shape? And they're data points that ultimately the company has to decide what's best. Some companies will do outsourcing if they're really small. They'll outsource to another company to do things like evaluate a vendor's SOC 2 report or evaluate a vendor's privacy support. And those are great when you don't have the resources, because you just pay a fee and these companies do it for you. But you can't transfer risk to other people. It doesn't work like that. If there's a problem at your, bank or credit union, and you've outsourced it to a vendor that does evaluation of those artifacts collected during your vendor risk management assessment, you're still the bank that's going to get fined if something goes wrong. You can't tell the bank examiner, oh, it was my third party, they had a problem, go find them. It doesn't work that way. You can buy insurance and mitigate it, but you can't transfer that risk.
Right.
You have to still deal with it.
Yeah, I like the piece you mentioned too with the assessment. You're doing all these vendor mapping exercises
Yeah,
to find out where all
absolutely.
those points are. So,
Yeah. Yeah,
but
it's really it's an effective way of providing additional insight into their supply chain to understand who they're doing
yeah,
business with. Because many organizations, if they don't dig deeper, and they know who the third parties are, but they couldn't tell you who their fourth parties are, and
yeah,
that's a problem.
yeah. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We're talking today with Terry Lee. We've chatted about operational resilience. We've chatted about vendor risk management. And next, we're going to talk about enterprise risk management. We'll be right back. If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.